Hello, queer Buddhist fam. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Stevie Inghram. My pronouns are they, she. I'm a queer and trans femme. And I'm super excited today to be here presenting on a topic that I'm quite passionate about. I'll be presenting on honoring the legacy of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld from a Buddhist perspective. But before I do so, just want to take up an opportunity to introduce myself a little bit further. As I said, my name's Stevie, and I'm a soon-to-be physician myself. I'm about a year from graduating medical school, which is why I'm super interested in this topic, and also, interested in honoring the legacy of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who had a major impact on queer and transgender rights globally. So I grew up as a Christian pastor's kid, and I think that's a commonality among us, especially in the Western part of the world, who maybe have had not so good experiences growing up in the Christian church or the Catholic church, or just the Protestant Christian faith in general. And so I began exploring yoga and Buddhism when I was in college about 15 plus years ago. And one of the books that really drew me to Buddhism was a book by Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, who today is one of my favorite teachers. So may Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh live in deep peace. He's an amazing teacher for those of you that may not know his name. But I first read Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Living Buddha, Living Christ, which to me served as a really great convergence between the Christian tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And then later on, as I mentioned, I began studying yoga as well. And around probably 2018, 2019, started studying with a Buddhist teacher named Reverend Koyo Kabose, who has lineage in Shin Buddhism, Shin, which is a Japanese form of Buddhism, which many people aren't too familiar with, but Japanese Buddhism fits under the bigger umbrella known as Mahayana Buddhism. So a lot of my personal perspectives come from that perspective itself. And also I've done a lot of studying of Reverend Koyo's father, who is named Reverend Gyome Kabose. And yeah, their teachings have been extraordinarily powerful to me. But I want to talk a little bit more about this convergence of holistic health, Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist concepts, and queer and trans healthcare and medicine all combined together in this talk. So just to set the stage a little bit for you, grab a cup of chai, some herbal tea, whatever you prefer. I specifically did not make us a PowerPoint presentation for my presentation right now. As a medical student, I gotta be honest, I'm a little tired and exhausted of PowerPoint presentations. So I just want my presentation today to be kind of like a Dharma talk. For you to sit back, sip some chai, take some notes if you would like. Otherwise, find a meditative posture, a comfortable meditative posture for you, and just sit back, enjoy. You don't even have to look at me or watch this video. You're welcome to just play the audio from this video and sit back and enjoy. And as I've been mentioning, the topic of today's talk is regarding Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a prolific physician for queer and trans people. But before I get to the actual talk today, I just want to acknowledge that I have a podcast named Queer Storytime, the podcast, which is available on all major podcasting platforms and on YouTube. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is not only to be a little bit self-promoting, but also to mention that if you want to have some more studies and learnings about Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, I dedicated a podcast episode to him. And that episode is episode number 11, and it's entitled Stonewall, Nazis, and the Global March for Queer and Trans Liberation. So I encourage you to listen to that. So let's get into today's talk about Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. So for those of you that don't know who he is, as I've mentioned, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld was a pioneering figure in LGBTQ plus advocacy and history. He has made an indelible mark and contributions to just fundamentally understanding human gender and sexuality at a time where that subject was incredibly controversial in the time of Nazi Germany. So Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld was known actually as the Einstein of sex. So his work really created a foundation for queer and trans rights globally. And he was one of there's been many queer and trans people working for and towards queer and trans liberation historically. But Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, as a physician and as a pioneer in queer and trans healthcare during the time of Nazi Germany, he deserves to be honored because he fought in a time where these topics, much like today, actually, with how we're experiencing things, within the United States with particular governors and states across the US trying to promote book bans about critical race theory, about queer and trans issues, and basically trying to block public interest from and literature on topics that are important to marginalized communities. So today we'll just explore his life, some of his major contributions, his legacy, and also, because this is a Buddhist conference, a queer Buddhist conference, I want to bring Buddhist philosophy and concepts and perspectives that kind of align with Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's advocacy and his just evident compassion and acceptance, and just overall promotion of the idea that diversity is natural to the human experience. So that's just a little introduction and indication of where we'll be headed in today's talk. So Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, he was born in mid to late 1800s, 1868 in Prussia. And which, to my understanding, again, I am not a historian, so I apologize if this is incorrect. But to my awareness, that was an area within Germany. And so he was born in this region of Germany. Obviously, as I've mentioned already, has a background in medicine. And unlike many of the physicians at his time, he was dedicated to studying gender and sexuality, which through his studies, led him to all of the advocacy against those that are marginalized and continue to be marginalized today due to their sexual identity or gender identity. So I like to take this opportunity to discuss one of the prime principles of Buddhism, which is this idea of karuna, otherwise translating as compassion, which is one of the major principles that Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld exemplified throughout his life. And this idea of living and embodying compassion outwardly reflects, his unwavering support for his fellow queer people and also transgender people, and just all of us within the LGBTQIA plus community, or what I like to refer to as the gender and sexually expansive community. And obviously, in that time when he was born, which was pre-Nazi Germany, but as he began to study and get into medicine and start taking care of patients in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, LGBT people were facing the same discriminations that they were back then. And all of this to say that Magnus Hirschfeld was this amazing and profound leader that held and embodied this deep level of compassion that extended to all of the injustices of societal norms, which I think really not only embodies compassion, but embodies this Buddhist idea of relieving the world of suffering. Magnus Hirschfeld, I think, from a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, represents this idea of a bodhisattva, this idea of seeking the relief of other people's suffering at the expense of your own. And so he's just a really powerful embodiment of all of these things. So later on in his life, more towards the later part of the 1800s, closer to the 1900s, in 1896, Magnus Hirschfeld began to publish a kind of a magazine, a pamphlet. He just began to publish some writings called Sappho and Socrates, which openly pre-1900s defended same-sex relationships and love. And I just think, in him not only acting in his role as physician, but then going out and, writing books, magazines, pamphlets, handing it out to people. I think this is another way in which he actively embodied the Buddhist concept of right speech. Because the speech that he did use outwardly, the things that he expressed outwardly in the world, were words used ultimately to reduce harm against queer and trans people of that time. And obviously that brings in another concept, another dharmic concept known as ahimsa. And what I've learned over my time, here in the West, we have this concept of ahimsa as almost an observation of non-harm. Some people might interpret that as being vegetarian. There's ultimately, I'm saying this because there's various interpretations of what ahimsa can look like, but one of the things that really connects with me personally is not only viewing ahimsa from an observational perspective, but ahimsa being the active disruption of harm in the world, which is something that clearly Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, through embodying the qualities that he has as a physician and as an educator and writer and author, he embodied that. Everything that he did was an active disruption of all of these societal norms that were against and oppressed queer and trans people. So Dr. Hirschfeld's, intention through this work obviously was to show that same-sex attraction and same-sex loving relationships was a natural part of human diversity, rather than being a disorder or a sin. which is what it might be considered in a lot of spaces in the Christian world specifically, and some of the other Abrahamic religions as well. And then obviously from the Buddhist perspective, there's this strong focus on viewing each individual, viewing each human being that presents in front of us with a non-judgmental and empathetic awareness. And, recognizing that suffering is often born from our own biases and our own fears. And so Buddhist practice, as all of us know, really, especially that practice of turning our awareness inward and radically sitting with the ways in which we view the world and the way in which we perceive other human beings that have some level of difference from us. These are all important practices so that we can live by that principle of ahimsa, of disrupting harm in the world. And so by Dr. Hirschfeld educating the public at Mass, I think his dharma, his path, was very much in alignment with, this alleviation of human suffering that is caused by misinformation and bias. And then 1 year after Hirschfeld started producing these educational pamphlets, in 1897, he found what he called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which was the first organization of its kind during this time, which was specifically dedicated to LGBTQIA plus rights. And the committee's motto, again, so very much in alignment with Buddhist understanding, the motto was justice through science. And I think, as I reflect on that concept, this idea of justice through science, seeking justice through observation. Science is a modality of human observation, of ways of understanding, just intricate things happening in the world, intricate processes happening in the world. But to me, this idea of justice through science really aligns with the Buddhist idea of prajna, which refers to wisdom. It's the Buddhist concept of wisdom. And in Buddhist practice, there is a lot of emphasis placed on the cultivation of prajna, of wisdom, as the cultivation of that and the natural arising of wisdom within us fundamentally allows us to see the world from a different perspective and allows us to continue pursuing that path of alleviating suffering throughout the world and ultimately cultivating a society that is more compassionate towards one another. So Hirschfeld's belief that scientific understanding could transform the social attitudes of his time, I think really deeply aligns with this Buddhist notion of, not only observing our own suffering, but through the observation of our own suffering, allowing our natural innate wisdom, prajna, to arise within us, and for us to then live out that wisdom in our daily lives. I see this as deeply connected with one another, as once we begin transforming ourselves, whether it's through the observation processes of the scientific method, or it's through the Buddhist lens of things, where we're turning our awareness almost as if we're using a microscope on ourselves and assessing the goings on within ourselves of our own suffering. and how we may be contributing to suffering in the world. And getting that understanding from a deep embodied perspective just so much aligns with this Buddhist notion of transforming within so that we can transform the world outside of ourselves. So I definitely think that from a philosophical perspective is in alignment with how Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld lived and embodied his life. And then beyond Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's writings, beyond the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and his work in that area, I know it's commonly perceived that his work primarily focused on sexual orientation because he himself was a gay man. But his work extended into advocacy for the transgender community and those that are gender expansive. And so, from a Buddhist perspective, his work really reflects this idea of anatta, which is one of the more mysterious concepts in Buddhist philosophy, especially if you're a newcomer to understanding Buddhist philosophy. But it's this idea of non-self. And I know to our Western minds, it's like, what? It's hard to even conceptualize. Because I think a lot of Westerners, especially if you've been trained in any level of human psychology, Western psychology specifically, we have concepts around the self, quote unquote, that are connected to Western psychology. However, this idea of non-self in Buddhism extends far beyond that Western psychology concept of self. And I think if there's any learnings from this idea of anatta, it's the idea that so many of us, especially in Western society, I would say, have such an extreme identification with who we are. And I definitely think Western society promotes that. Now, I'm not saying that identifying as queer and transgender is bad, because I think it's important that we as queer and trans people have language to understand our lived experiences and how we're feeling inside. But I think the teaching of anatta, of non-self, teaches us that, maybe our identification around our ideas of self are not so rigid. I think that's kind of a good connecting point for our Western mind. And by kind of embodying this non-rigidity, we begin to see that there's this dynamicness, this fluidity in human identity in general. So I say all of this to say that Hirschfeld's approach to human gender and sexuality, he saw as just natural variations of the human experience, which I think supports this Buddhist idea of this non-concrete self, this ever-evolving, ever-changing fluidness of human experience, and this acceptance of that change. And the dynamicness of human nature. So, I think that's a really important concept for all of us, that we hopefully can learn through our practice to not be so rigidly resistant to the dynamicness of life, to the fluidity of life, and have such a rigid attachment to the ways in which we view the world and also the ways in which we view ourselves. So I think this is a super fascinating topic for all of us to consider, for all human beings to consider. But I think it has a super important connection for those of us that identify as queer and trans. So then a little bit later on, as he was, continuing on in his work and study, around 1919, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld founded the Institute of Sexual Research in Berlin, which was a center that provided medical care, counseling, and education to LGBTQIA plus people. And I think, here's a prime example of the idea of right livelihood. He dedicated his entire life's path to our community, to relieving the suffering that our community faces and to amplifying the well-being that our community experiences as a whole. And so not only did the Institute of Sexual Research support LGBTQ individuals, but obviously through his writings and education, he emphasized compassion and inclusivity within society. And so through all of this work, this institute really became a refuge where people could find acceptance and find a community of solidarity that supported them for how they express that they are and how they want to embody and live into their identity. And I think it's an amazing convergence with the whole idea of like taking refuge from a Buddhist perspective. This emphasis on taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, in the three jewels. And I think I kind of see his work as an extension of cultivating the three jewels, because not only did he embody the Buddhist teachings, not only did he embody the Dharma overall, but he created space and created refuge and created sanctuary through his medical practice and through all of the organizations and spaces that kind of gathered within the Institute of Sexual Research. So well into Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld establishing the Institute of Sexual Research, he actually he was one of the first major pioneers in what we now call today gender affirming surgery. He was developing at that time in the early 1900s the tools, techniques, and practices around gender affirming care specifically. So his work was extraordinarily pioneering at his time when this had never happened before in human history. So we could state that Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld was one of the major contributors to where we've gotten today in regards to gender affirming surgery. So, in his work, working with transgender individuals, he provided hormone treatments, surgical procedures, and just overall a transformative experience for our community. And so I just think about, this idea of transformation, this idea of metta, of loving kindness or karuna, compassion, is just so alignment in his work and in his offerings of providing people the opportunity to align their external, appearance with their internalized sense of self, with their internalized identity. And it's his recognition ultimately of each individual's unique journey towards self-realization really aligns with Buddhism's acknowledgement of the diverse paths that people take toward understanding what's called in the Buddhist tradition your true nature. So now, whereas all of this was amazing, and he was doing the work of liberation, he really was. And I think all of us know, especially if we're in the advocacy space for queer and transgender rights, we know that that work of liberation does not come without resistance. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld was actively practicing at his Institute of Sexual Research actively during Nazi Germany. And despite all of these amazing qualities of a bodhisattva that he embodied in his daily life and helping the queer and trans community, Hirschfeld, being a gay man himself and being such an outspoken advocate for the community, faced significant persecution. And in 1933, specifically, the Nazi regime targeted his Institute of Sexual Research. Basically, what happened, and I mentioned this in my podcast episode, basically what happened is they raided his Institute of Sexual Research. They pulled out thousands of books that he had not only written, but thousands of books that he had collected in that space. And they pulled out all of the books, dumped them on the streets in Germany, lit the books on fire, which is exactly what we're seeing here in the United States. They might not be lighting books on fire, but they're trying to actively ban books right now. So this happened very personally to Dr. Hirschfeld. And, if there's any Buddhist concept that this underscores, it's this idea of dukkha, or duk, which is a word that can, that here in the West we translate as suffering. We can translate it as unsatisfactoriness, which simply, it's an acknowledgement that conflict, violence often arises from attachment to rigid beliefs and intolerance, which is exactly what fascism is. So Hirschfeld's response to this, suffering that the queer and trans community was actively experiencing under the Nazi regime, was simply to continue his work. Nobody was going to stop him in continuing to advocate for queer and transgender human beings, which, just quite frankly, represents how utterly resilient he himself was in the face of adversity. Which is another major quality that I would say that Buddhism as a whole highly values. So even though that Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's work was largely lost due to these Nazi book burnings, his indelible influence continues to endure. And I just find it astounding. I feel honored to be here presenting this information to you today on his pioneering research Because as I mentioned at the beginning, he fundamentally laid the groundwork for the modern LGBTQIA rights movement globally, and specifically in regards to LGBTQIA plus healthcare, which we're seeing is being hotly contested in debate and debated, throughout the world right now. And I just want to point to, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this idea of dukkha, and this idea of impermanence. That's the one major teaching, if anything, that Buddhism teaches, is the ongoing and ever evolving concept of impermanence. What I'm trying to say is that the one permanent in life is impermanence. So, when we account for this impermanence and the suffering that was initially caused by these Nazi book bans, and through all of the persecution that he faced, and through his just visible embodied wisdom and resilience, we can just so keenly see how him as a human being embodied so many of the principles of Buddhism, and just of being a decent human being. So there's one thing that as I was reflecting on his life and reflecting on Buddhism, it's this, this idea from this perspective of impermanence, this idea that regardless of, in terms of making a contribution in society, and obviously he made a massive contribution to society, but from that perspective of impermanence, Buddhism doesn't teach that these contributions in society are bound to these materialistic forms. Whereas it's such a massive, heart-wrenching thing to acknowledge that, like, queer and trans affirming healthcare could have been so much more progressive from the early 1900s if there wasn't this Nazi book ban, or this Nazi book fire. And it just makes you think, like, what if, like, we could potentially be much more progressed within healthcare if we would have had the depth of literature that man produced, if it would not have been burned by the Nazis. But regardless of all of that, and regardless of our lack of being able to control situations such as these, I want to point to the truth that, like, my apologies, I was just getting a phone call. The point that I'm trying to make here is that, Buddhism teaches that when making contributions to society, it's not bound by these materialistic forms. And I think what we can really do to honor Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld is just continue to acknowledge his history, acknowledge all of the contributions that he has made for our community, and allow his life and his wisdom and compassion to be an inspiration to us, to continue on this pursuit of pursuing queer and trans liberation for all of us across the globe. So thank you all for tuning in to this talk today. I hope it was as inspiring to you as it was to me to talk about this topic and to share about Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's life. It's been truly an honor, as we say in the Japanese Buddhist tradition, Namu Amida Butsu. So I bow to each and every single one of you, and so appreciate you sharing your heart and sharing this space with me. And I look forward to hearing from you soon. If you would like to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on social media. You can find me at Queer Trans Thriving on Instagram and TikTok. If you'd like to reach out to me personally, my email is I'll give you my Queer Storytime podcast email. It's simply queerstorytimethepodcast@gmail.com. You can contact me there. And if any of you would like to be on my podcast and share your own queer and trans story of what I like to call radical acceptance, affirmation, and healing, please do reach out, as I'm actively always taking guests for my Queer Storytime podcast. And you're certainly too welcome to listen to the IQBC's founder, Dr. Jumpa Verst, who was on, I believe it was episode number 4 of the Queer Storytime podcast. So you can listen to Dr. Jampa's episode of QST there as well. So otherwise, I look forward to staying in touch with you all. Thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing this space with me. It's truly been an honor to be here with you and to share about Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. Be well, everyone.